ninth chords, 13th chords, quintal and quartal harmony, parallel harmony, melodic themes that are subject to reharmonization. These are all important hallmarks of Claude Debussy's impressionistic compositional style. And I've got links to a lot of videos on these topics. If you're interested, I'll put the links right here in the upper right-hand corner. But in this video, I'd like to home in on a different aspect of his style, and that is his fondness for tonal ambiguity. The idea that even though the harmony might be tonal and diatonic, the tonal center can be rather shifting and elusive. Debussy loves to write phrases and cadences that are very surprising, often keeping the listener off balance and asking the question, what is the tonal center? In this video, I'd like to take a look at the first several measures of his piece Sarabande. That's the second movement of his suite Pour le piano. Since the key signature has 4 sharps, and the melodic gestures seem to imply the key of E major, let's first write out a chart of all the chords in that key. Debussy builds many chords to the 7th. Let's write the chart with chords built up to the 7th as well. We'll identify the Roman numerals here, but let's also name the chord qualities. I like to label the quality of the triad as well as the quality of the 7th. So I'll label the 1-7 chord major, major 7, meaning a major triad with a major 7th. The 2-7 chord is minor, minor 7, a minor triad with a minor 7th. And then minor, minor 7, major, major 7, major, minor 7, minor, minor 7, and diminished minor 7 for the 7 chord, which is also called half diminished. Now the choice of chords in the first 4 measures seems largely dictated by the simple 5-note melody. Notice how the chords are diatonic, but that they seem to retain the same voicing that moves nearly parallel to the melody. You can watch the video on parallel harmony for a further explanation. Interestingly, the chords also seem somewhat traditionally functional in the key of E major. The 7 half diminished chord and the 5 chord are dominant, and the 2-7 chord is a dominant preparation, and of course the 1 chord is tonic. Debussy even adjusts one note of the parallel voicing on the 3rd chord. He writes an A instead of a G sharp on the lowest pitch. This strengthens the tonal implication of the phrase by including a very clear spelling of the dominant chord, a 5-2, the 3rd inversion of 5-7, leading eventually to the 1 chord in the 2nd measure. The real surprise comes at the cadence, which is the 3 chord. Well, that was unexpected. It is certainly not traditional to cadence on a 3 chord. Could he be intending for us to hear G sharp minor as the tonal center and not E major? Is it G sharp Phrygian? In any event, it's a sudden turn, and it seems to throw our tonal grounding a bit off balance. The next two measures are a near repetition of the first phrase. The phrase from measure 5 to the beginning of measure 6 is a simple melody, unaccompanied by harmony. The implication here is C sharp minor, perhaps the 6th chord in the key of E major. But the tonal implication of C sharp as the tonal center is rather strong. See the 5th relationship between G sharp and C sharp, as well as the gesture to the upper C sharp and the lower C sharp? Did he intend for us to regard C sharp as the tonal center all along? After all, in that mysterious and abrupt cadence to G sharp minor back in the first two phrases, the G sharp minor chord could be anticipating this as a kind of modal dominant of C sharp minor. Maybe better described as C sharp aeolian, since there is no raised leading tone. Now looking forward, the C sharp minor implication is rather short-lived. A gesture to E major again follows, with the diatonic descending progression 4, 3, 2, 7, 1, 7, and then repeated. But notice that this is not the cadence. The contrary motion voicings continue to the 5 chord, B, at the end of the phrase. Perhaps a half cadence in E major, if we are even hearing E major at this point. The B major triad almost stands on its own in our ears as a new tonal center. Perhaps B mixolydian? The next two phrases are somewhat transitional and unusual in a traditional tonal context. Thinking in the key of E major, we have a 4 chord, but then a 2 major chord and a 7 minor 7 chord, and these really do not fit in the key of E major. The pitch A natural has transitioned to A sharp, almost like a leading tone in B major. The actual progression is a great example of chromatic median chords, where the progression is moving in thirds, but with this jarring chromatic shift from A to A sharp. You can watch my video on chromatic third relationships. What follows in measure 11 and 12 is quintessentially Debussy. The chords are all consistently dominant 7th in quality, but they are tonally disorienting. Notice that they are strictly parallel and not diatonic. In construction, since they are all of the same quality, we call this strict planing. Also notice that by tracing the intervals of the bass line, as well as the notes of the right hand, we have the outline of a whole tone scale: F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, C, D, E, F sharp. And this is a scale rather devoid of centricity, since it includes no half-step tendency tones. However, the first chord of each of these measures seems tonally important. With a continuation of the prominent A sharp from the previous measures, this F sharp 7 chord is the dominant of B major. Remember that strong cadence to B major in measure 8? Let's analyze it in B major. A sharp half diminished also fits into this scheme, as the 7 half diminished 7 is another dominant functioning chord in the key of B major. But again, our tonal analysis is foiled at the cadence, where Debussy moves abruptly to a D sharp major triad. And what are we to make of this? The implication of the previous progression seemed to point to B major, but the cadence is to a major triad on the 3rd scale degree of B major. Remember that the first phrase of this piece did something similar, where the implication of E major was foiled by a cadence to the 3 chord, G sharp minor. In fact, what happens next is a return to this first phrase, with a cadence on G sharp minor. But in this cadence, the D sharp major triad we just heard in measure 14 may have some bearing on strengthening our perception of G sharp as the tonal center here, since D sharp major is the dominant of G sharp minor. memorize the last phrase in E major, following the implication of the melody. The chords 6, 5, 4, and then the same melody without harmony, but with a strong gesture to E major. Except, that is, for the very end of this section, Debussy shifts again. He ultimately writes F sharp to C sharp for the cadence, the outline of a plagal cadence in C sharp minor. So, what are we to make of the tonality of all these measures? It seems that Debussy is interested in a very fluid sense of tonal center, such that whenever we seem to hear it locking in, he can abruptly change it. This is tonal ambiguity at its finest. The effect is that we hear a very expanded concept of tonality, where tonal center is very malleable, and we are forced to consider the totality of all these implications within the scale.